So this is atypical for this series, but I didn't really have time to write a script or anything, so I decided to play War Thunder and ad-lib with Thinky. I hope you guys like it because I'm simply way too tired to make a script and everything right now. But here it is. But yeah, I just quickly scanned over the Honeycut book, and I just figured we could very briefly go over everything. How I understand it is that in North Africa, they were using mostly like M3s and M5s, and even at that point, they're like, "Hey, this 37mm isn't very good against tanks." Like, didn't the chieftain have this story about a bunch of M3s swarming a tiger or something?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was in the Eastern Theater or in the Mediterranean, but I know that, yeah, the 37 lacked punch, and of course that was the principal anti-tank gun in 1942 for the light company, but it was pretty anemic by most standards by the time it actually entered service. And, you know, for the M5 and the M3, it was acceptable because that wasn't its principal role of anti-tank work, but they recognized that if they were going to be doing anything more substantial with these vehicles, they wanted a bigger punch. And, well, the big thing you get with the 75 is you get a much more substantial high explosive charge.
Yeah, the 75 HE round had, I think it was roughly equivalent to the 105 HE in terms of at least like the splash pattern.
Yeah, in terms of actual, I think if we're referring to the same document, I think it was called casualty causing fragmentation, where the 75 was almost equivalent, or maybe even equivalent to the 105 howitzer.
Initially, the Chaffee wasn't the answer to their, like, how do we upgun this thing? That was the M7, but that was obviously too fat eventually. And I think they went with the 57 originally on the T7E2.
Yeah, they did. It wasn't an ideal solution by any means. I mean, the 57 wasn't a bad gun by any stretch, but it really did lack the same HE punch as the 75. And someone, I think, recognized that, you know, the AT punch of the 75 is good enough anyways. In addition to the fact that you get a lot more punch against, you know, AT guns, light vehicles, and infantry, which is a much more common threat to a light tank than something like a Panzer IV or a Panther.
Oop. Oh, I just got bombed.
Yeah, I just saw that. Switching to HE with the Bofors.
He had this delay on like 3 seconds or something. I probably could have driven away.
I think it's an IAR, is it?
I think they made a point to use as many M5 components as possible, or at least the engine. And obviously it helps that once the Chaffee finally did get into theater, most of the crews knew how to maintain it. They had supplies already available, and obviously they sort of knew the quirks of it. What I find the most interesting about the Chaffee is that you would think it would use the M3, but it uses a modified version of the PBJ's gun.
Yeah, I believe it was a gun that was originally destined for the B-25H, which was a solid nose aircraft primarily used for anti-fortification and anti-shipping. Ended up the B-25s preferred going without the solid nose and the cannon, but the cannon developed for that, which was I believe the M6, proved to be fairly lightweight and pretty dependable.
Yeah,
and so,
like,
logically, for a light tank, that might be the better option to go, since it is a much lighter mount.
Yeah, it was something like half the weight of the M3 and had a much longer recoil stroke. Yeah, and the Chaffee also, I think it was the first US tank to use a torsion bar suspension system, wasn't it? At least in service.
I believe that's correct, yeah. Of course, most next-generation tanks being developed were with torsion bar, but the Chaffee got to the field a lot earlier than the Pershing did. Or at least it actually saw meaningful combat in the Second World War.
I think the T-23E3 might have been the first, like, prototype tank to have it, but Chaffee was
but
the first service tank.
I'm sorry, but the T-23 was kind of garbage. I'm distracting something. Yeah, that Panther.
Yeah, I got him.
Distraction successful, I guess.
As far as issues, I don't think there were many issues with the Chaffee, except for maybe I recall reading that in Europe they ran out of ammo a lot.
Or they were sure firing quite a lot, especially during the later stages of the war where they were being used for more support roles than their originally just pure reconnaissance.
Yeah, I don't think there were any mechanical issues. I know its performance off-road was pretty good. The crews generally liked it pretty well.
I think as far as the next generation tanks of the Second World War for the U.S. Armored Forces go, it was probably the best off out of all of them in terms of reliability. Certainly better than the Pershing when it first came into service.
They did complain that the 75 wasn't very good against Panthers. But I feel like that's not a really fair complaint, like for a light tank at least.
Maybe not a fair complaint, but if you're the crew on the long end of a Panther, you probably don't care what the doctrine or what the employment is. You want a longer, punchier gun. When people think of light tanks, they think of tanks that can move fast on a battlefield. But I think the untold story of that is how light tanks are much easier on local infrastructure or getting around difficult terrain. So things like, hold on.
Yeah, I think
cannon breach. Okay.
I think that's why Japan preferred the M24 over something like the M26 or the M4, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of any issues it had, but all I can think of is that they didn't like how anemic it was, at least cannon-wise, against tanks.
Well, I do know that the internal ergonomics were complained about a couple of times.
I believe
the turret basket was gradually, in the prototype stage, made smaller and smaller, and then they removed it entirely. And you were kind of just elbow to elbow with your fellow crewmates in the Chaffee.
Yeah, that does make sense. Oh, I see a tiger. I'm gonna try and kill that. If I can...
Lower hull, let's go for it.
Got it.
I believe the Marines got their hands on M24s as well. I think that was sort of fitting into their doctrine of, light support vehicles in the initial landing and heavier vehicles following them up.
Really?
The heavier vehicle, yeah.
I thought it was a pure army vehicle.
It might have been that the M24 was given through attachments, but I do recall that there were reports from USMC crews manning the M24. But I'd have to double check to make sure that that wasn't just a couple of one-off things in Korea. It could have done with a bit of a beefier engine by 1945, but that's also somewhat countermanded by the fact that it still had very good and capable mobility off-road. So, I think as far as downsides or detriments, as you're mentioning, the thing that sort of pops to mind for a lot of people is Korea, right? Where Chaffees did not perform well initially in 1950 against DPRK T-34-85s. And, that's a fair criticism to make because 75 was not well suited to dealing with those vehicles from the front. However, I think many people also just consider that phase of the Korean War as both the beginning and the end of the M24's involvement in Korea, and that couldn't be further from the truth. After T-34s were less and less of a problem because heavier armor was dealing and dispatching with them very readily, the M24 was actually preferred over the Pershing and M46 tanks in Korea, at least according to one report that I was reading. The M4 and the M24 were the most preferred tank types in theater.
Can I penetrate a Tiger 2P anywhere?
If you bounce it, but I'm not sure how reliable that would be.
Okay, I can go through the side. I can go through the upper side. That was scary. They didn't make any variants of it besides the T-24E1, which is the radial engine variant that wasn't very good.
Yeah, no, the radial engine variant of it was...
And it didn't work very well either.
I believe it had a lot of overheating problems, but I'm not exactly sure.
I know the transmission on it wasn't very good.
But you know, some of the interesting things were like very early prototype ammunition they were developing for the 75. There we go, 110 down. One of the rounds that was developed post-war with the 75 that actually entered service was T148, which was type classified as M338, I believe. It was a truncated penetrator. What that essentially means is it's a complete blunt nose with no angle or curve whatsoever. The purpose of that being that you would, you know, it would be much better against high obliquity armor to things like 55 degrees. And under test, it worked actually pretty well. But as you might expect, that didn't really enter service until the Korean War kicked off, and so while it would have improved performance of the Chaffee against T-34s, it wasn't until after they first ran into them that it was actually being distributed.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a whole lot more to say on the Chaffee's history, but it's one of my favorite tanks, and I appreciate it a lot, because, you know, light tanks are cool.
Well, a lot of tanks, I think, get caught with the bloat of armor, engine, gun, and all those things. I think the Chaffee ultimately sort of proves the point that you don't need gun, the thickest armor, or the biggest engine to make a vehicle that is effective and actually useful. And you know, I think it's sort of it's a defiance of the armor trifecta, and yet was still a very, very effective vehicle in its role.